Rosalind had no idea that the man sitting across from her in the cramped mountain tavern commanded an army of 10,000 wolves. She only knew that his eyes hadn't left her face in 20 minutes, and that the storm raging outside had trapped them both in this place until morning. The fire crackled between them. Wind howled against the shutters like something alive and desperate to get in. She pulled her threadbare cloak tighter and tried to ignore the strange heat spreading through her chest every time their gazes accidentally met. He was too large for the wooden chair. Too refined for a place like this, with his dark traveling cloak trimmed in silver and his hands that looked like they'd never known a day of hard labor. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, dusted with the shadow of a beard, and his eyes were the color of winter storms, pale gray with flecks of blue that caught the firelight like scattered ice. Rosalind had spent 3 years running from powerful men. She knew danger when she saw it. This man was danger wrapped in silence and expensive leather boots. The tavern keeper had fled to the back rooms an hour ago, muttering something about checking the cellar stores. She suspected he simply didn't want to be present for whatever was brewing between the lone female traveler and the stranger who'd arrived just before the blizzard hit. Smart man. Rosalind was less fortunate. The storm had caught her on the mountain pass, forcing her to seek shelter in the first building she'd found. She'd planned to be 3 villages away by nightfall. Instead, she was trapped in a room that suddenly felt far too small, with a man whose presence seemed to consume all the oxygen. He shifted in his chair. The movement was fluid, predatory, and her pulse jumped despite herself. Don't react, she told herself. Don't let him see. But something in his expression suggested he already knew exactly what effect he had on her. The corner of his mouth curved upward, just barely, and heat flooded her cheeks. She looked away first, hated herself for it. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Rosalind reached for the cup of mulled wine the tavern keeper had left her and took a long drink, grateful for something to do with her hands. When she looked up again, he was still watching. Enough, she thought. If he wanted to play this game, fine. But she'd spent too long surviving to be intimidated by a wealthy stranger with an unsettling stare. She met his gaze head-on, lifted her chin, let the challenge blaze in her eyes. His pupils dilated. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and accompanied by a sharp intake of breath that he couldn't quite hide. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Hunger, raw and consuming. Rosalind's heart slammed against her ribs. No. She was projecting. She had to be. Men like him didn't look at women like her that way. Women with dirt under their fingernails and clothes that had been mended too many times to count. Women who smelled like pine needles and desperation. But he was still looking at her like she'd hung the stars in the sky. Like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. It terrified her. It thrilled her. It made absolutely no sense. He rose from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving her time to flee if she wanted to. Rosalind stayed frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as he crossed the distance between them and lowered himself into the chair at her table. This close, she could see the silver threads woven through his dark hair at the temples, could smell him, pine and leather and something wild underneath, something that made her want to lean closer and inhale. Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deeper than she'd expected. Rougher, like he hadn't used it in a long time and had forgotten how to be gentle with it. Theron, he said. His name fell between them like an offering. Rosalind pressed her lips together. Giving him her name felt dangerous, like handing him a weapon he could use against her later. But something in his expression made her want to trust him. Something patient and steady beneath all that intensity. Rosalind, she heard herself say. His eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they were blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. He repeated her name like a prayer, like a promise. Like he was committing the sound of it to memory so he could carry it with him forever. The wind screamed outside, the fire popped and hissed, and Rosalind felt the walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack. She should leave. Storm or no storm, she should walk out that door and take her chances with the blizzard. Anything was better than sitting here, drowning in this stranger's gaze, feeling things she'd sworn never to feel again. But her body refused to cooperate. Some instinct older than fear, older than logic, kept her rooted to the spot. "What are you?" she whispered. The question escaped before she could stop it. It was too blunt, too revealing. It told him she'd sensed something different about him. Something not quite human. His smile was slow and devastating. "You know what I am." And the terrible thing was, she did. Some part of her had known from the moment he walked through that door. The grace of his movements, the predatory stillness. The way the tavern keeper had practically tripped over himself to stay out of this man's path. "Wolf," she breathed. His eyes flared silver. Just for a moment. Just long enough to confirm everything. Rosalind should have been afraid. She'd heard stories about the wolf shifters who ruled the northern kingdoms. Brutal, possessive, dangerous beyond measure. They took human mates without asking permission, bound them with mystical bonds that could never be broken. She should have run. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn by a force she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Theron's hand moved toward her face, then stopped. Hovered in the air between them, asking permission. Rosalind nodded before she could think better of it. His fingers brushed her cheek. The touch was feather-light, barely there, and yet it sent electricity cascading through her entire body. She gasped. He made a sound low in his chest, almost like a growl, but softer. More desperate. "What is this?" Her voice came out shaky. "What's happening?" His thumb traced her cheekbone. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you for 200 years. The confession hit her like a physical blow. 200 years. The weight of it was staggering. The loneliness it implied. The hope and disappointment. And hope again. Over and over. For centuries. "That's impossible," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. She could feel it now, the connection between them. A golden thread stretching from her chest to his, humming with a frequency only she could hear. It had been there since he walked through the door. She'd been too afraid to acknowledge it. "Mate," Theron said simply. "The bond recognizes you. It always knows." Rosalind yanked away from his touch. The loss of contact was physically painful, a cold ache spreading through her chest, but she ignored it. Stumbled back from the table, put as much distance between them as the small room allowed. "No." Her hands were shaking. "I don't. I can't. No." Because she understood now. Understood what he was offering, what he was claiming. A wolf shifter's mate bond was permanent. Unbreakable. It meant leaving behind everything she'd known, everything she'd been running toward. It meant binding herself to this stranger, this king, this beautiful, terrifying man who looked at her like she was his entire world. It meant staying. Rosalind had never stayed anywhere. Staying meant being caught. Staying meant the hunters would find her. Staying meant death. Theron didn't move toward her, didn't try to close the distance she'd created. But his voice, when he spoke, cracked with something raw and vulnerable. "I won't force you." The words sounded like they cost him. "Whatever you've heard about wolf bonds, about alphas taking what they want, I swear to you, Rosalind, I would rather spend another 200 years alone than have you come to me against your will." She wanted to believe him. Gods help her, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But she'd believed beautiful promises before, had trusted the wrong people, loved the wrong people, and paid for it in blood and tears and 3 years of running. "You don't know me," she said. The words came out harsh, defensive. You don't know what I've done. What's hunting me? If you knew the truth, you wouldn't want this. You wouldn't want me. His laugh was soft and humorless. I know exactly who you are. Her blood went cold. What? The fire shifted. Shadows danced across his face, and suddenly he looked ancient, weary in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Rosalind Blackwood, he said quietly, daughter of the late Lord and Lady Blackwood of the Southern Reaches, accused of murdering your parents 3 years ago. Hunted by the Crown ever since, despite the fact that you were miles away when they died, visiting your ailing grandmother. The real killer was your uncle, who wanted the estate for himself, and framed you, rather than risk you exposing the truth. The room tilted. Rosalind grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. How? She started, then couldn't continue. Her throat had closed up. I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. His voice was gentle now, gentle and sad. Information reaches me from every corner of the continent. I've known about you for 2 years. I've been following your trail for 18 months, not to capture you, to help you. Tears burned behind her eyes. She refused to let them fall. Why? Why would you care about a human noble accused of murder? Because I felt the bond, Rosalind. Theron's hand pressed against his own chest, even from hundreds of miles away, even without knowing your face or your name. I felt you. Every night you spent cold and afraid, every day you went hungry, every moment you thought you were alone. I felt it. And it nearly destroyed me. A sob escaped her. She clapped a hand over her mouth, but the damage was done. The walls were crumbling. Years of survival instinct, years of trusting no one, years of keeping everyone at arm's length. All of it was collapsing under the weight of his words. He felt her. He knew her. He'd been searching for her, not to drag her back to face false charges, but to save her. It was too much. It was everything she'd ever wanted and been too afraid to hope for. Tell me about them, she heard herself say. About your search. She wasn't sure why she asked. Maybe she needed to hear it. Needed proof that this wasn't some elaborate trick, some new way for the universe to hurt her. Theron's expression softened. He gestured to the chair beside her, a silent question, and when she nodded, he sat. Not too close. Close enough. The first time I felt you, he began, his voice low and reverent. I was in my council chambers, reviewing border disputes. I thought I was dying. The pain in my chest was so sudden, so overwhelming, I collapsed. My advisors thought I'd been poisoned. He shook his head, smiling faintly at the memory. It took me 3 days to understand what had happened, to realize that somewhere in the world my mate existed, and she was suffering. Rosalind's throat tightened. She did the math. That was the night my parents died. I know that now. His hand twitched toward hers, then stopped. I sent scouts everywhere, offered rewards for information about any woman fitting the description the bond was showing me. Flashes of dark hair, the scent of wildflowers, the feeling of fear and grief and stubborn, defiant strength. She made a choked sound, half laugh, half sob. That could have been anyone. No. His eyes found hers, fierce with certainty. It was only ever you. The bond doesn't lie, Rosalind. It showed me your courage before I knew your face. Showed me your kindness, your pain, your determination to survive. I fell in love with you 100 times before we ever met. The words pierced something deep inside her, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Hope. I can't, she whispered again, but this time the words held no conviction. I don't. Long distance. Your kingdom is thousands of miles from anywhere I could hide. I don't do long distance. I won't be some war prize you visit twice a year when you remember I exist. Theron was quiet for a long moment. The storm outside had softened slightly, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan, and in the relative silence, she could hear her own heartbeat pounding. Then he rose from his chair, crossed the room in 3 strides, stopped just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, but not close enough to touch. His eyes burned into hers. "Rosalind," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her knees weak. "If you think I would ever let an ocean or a mountain range or a kingdom stand between us, you haven't been paying attention." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you told me right now that you wanted to live in a cave at the bottom of the sea, I would find a way to breathe underwater. I'm saying that my kingdom is nothing without you. My throne means nothing. My power, my armies, my wealth, all of it is worthless if you're not beside me." She was crying now. She couldn't help it. The tears streamed down her face and she didn't have the strength to stop them. Theron's hand came up to cup her cheek. He caught a tear on his thumb and brushed it away with infinite tenderness. "Tell me what you need," he whispered. "Tell me, and it's yours. Anything. Everything." She laughed, the sound broken and wet. "That's insane. You can't relocate an entire kingdom because of one woman." His smile was fierce and bright and absolutely certain. "Watch me." The words hung in the air between them. Rosalind stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hint that he didn't mean exactly what he was saying. She found nothing but unwavering conviction. "You're serious," she breathed. "I've never been more serious about anything in my 247 years of existence." Her mind raced. It was impossible. It was absurd. Kings didn't uproot their entire civilizations for love. That wasn't how the world worked. That wasn't how anything worked. But Theron was looking at her like he would tear down the mountains and rebuild them somewhere more convenient if she asked him to. Like she was the center of his universe, and everything else was just noise. "Kiss me," she said. The words surprised her as much as they surprised him, but she didn't take them back. Didn't want to. She needed to know if this was real. If the feeling burning through her chest was actually the mate bond or just desperate loneliness disguised as something more. She needed to feel his mouth on hers and see if the universe shifted the way she suspected it might. Theron went very still. "You're certain?" "No. But kiss me anyway." His laugh was low and warm and did things to her insides that should have been illegal. Then he cradled her face in both hands and lowered his mouth to hers. The bond roared to life. It was like nothing Rosalind had ever experienced. Heat and light, and a sensation of falling and flying at the same time. The golden thread between them blazed bright, snapping into place with an almost audible click. She felt Theron everywhere, in her blood, in her bones, in the secret chambers of her heart she'd kept locked away from the world. His lips moved against hers, gentle at first, then deeper, more demanding. She matched his intensity with her own, fisting her hands in his cloak and pulling him closer. He groaned against her mouth, a sound of pure relief, and the vibration traveled through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Theron pressed his forehead to hers, eyes still closed, hands trembling slightly where they cupped her face. "Rosalind," he rasped. "My Rosalind." "Yours," she agreed, and the word felt like coming home. They spent the night talking, pressed together on a narrow cot in the back room, wrapped in each other's arms. They told each other everything. Rosalind spoke about her parents, about the night she'd found out about their deaths, and realized she was being framed, about the years of running, the close calls, the loneliness that had become so familiar, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm. She told him about the tavern keeper in the coastal city who had hidden her in his cellar when the hunters came, about the merchant's daughter who had shared her bread when Rosalind had nothing, about the old woman in the mountains who had taught her to forage, to survive, to keep moving when every part of her wanted to give up. Theron listened, held her closer, pressed kisses to her hair when her voice broke. Then he told her about his kingdom, about the burden of ruling alone for so long, about the council members who pressured him to take a political mate, about the wars he'd fought, and the peace he'd built, and the emptiness that had lived inside him for 2 centuries while he waited for her. He spoke of his parents, long dead, and the sister he'd lost to illness before the bond could find her a mate. He spoke of the loneliness of immortality, of watching generations pass while he remained unchanged, of the moment he'd felt her through the bond and known, with absolute certainty, that his long solitude was finally ending. When the sun rose, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and glittering and new. Theron stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the snow gold and pink. Rosalind came to stand beside him, and without looking, he reached out and took her hand. "So," he said, "where do you want to live?" She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "You were serious about that." "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." She considered the question, thought about all the places she'd been, all the temporary shelters and cramped hiding spots and lonely roads, thought about what it might feel like to actually belong somewhere. "There's a valley," she said slowly, "on the border between the southern reaches and the central kingdom. It's where my grandmother lived, before she died. The land there is fertile and green, and there's a river that runs through it that turns to gold at sunset." She paused. "I always told myself that someday, when I was free, I'd go back there, build a house, plant a garden, stay. Then that's where we'll go." He said it so simply, like uprooting his entire kingdom to follow her to a valley he'd never seen was the most natural thing in the world. "Theron," she started. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes stole her breath. "I meant what I said last night." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. "You are my mate, my queen, my everything. Wherever you are, that's where my home is. My people will follow because they trust me, and because once they meet you, they'll understand why I couldn't let anything as insignificant as geography keep us apart." Tears pricked at her eyes again. "But what about? I mean, I'm still technically a fugitive." "Your uncle," he said. "Your uncle," Theron interrupted, his voice going cold and hard, "will be dealt with. I've already sent word to my council. By the time we reach my territory, they'll have gathered enough evidence to prove your innocence and expose his crimes. You'll be cleared of all charges within the month." "Just like that?" "Just like that." His smile returned, softening the edges of his face. "Being the Alpha King has to be good for something." She laughed. The sound was lighter than anything she'd felt in years. The journey to the Northern Territories took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of traveling through snow-covered passes and frozen forests, of sleeping in roadside inns and occasionally under the stars when no shelter could be found. 3 weeks of learning each other. Rosalind discovered that Theron snored when he slept on his back, that he hated mushrooms with a passion that bordered on irrational, that he could spend hours reading battle histories but fell asleep within minutes when faced with economic reports, that he laughed rarely, but when he did, the sound transformed his entire face, making him look younger, softer, almost boyish. She discovered that he was terrified of losing her, that he woke in the night sometimes, reaching for her in the darkness, unable to breathe until his hands found her warmth. That the 2 centuries of loneliness had left scars she couldn't see but could feel through the bond, jagged edges of old pain that were slowly healing now that she was here. And he discovered her, too. Learned that she talked in her sleep, fragments of conversations with people who weren't there. That she had an unexpectedly vicious competitive streak when it came to card games. That she could identify any edible plant within a 100-mile radius, but couldn't cook to save her life. That she was braver than anyone he'd ever met, and more fragile than she would ever admit. By the time they reached his palace, Rosalind was no longer afraid. Nervous, yes, Overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the building, with its towering spires and its army of servants and its halls that seemed to go on forever, but not afraid, because Theron was beside her. And that, she was learning, made all the difference. The council had been skeptical at first. A human mate, a fugitive, a woman with no political connections and no wealth, and nothing to offer but herself. Rosalind had seen the doubt in their eyes during that first meeting, the careful assessment, the calculation of how she might be used or discarded. But Theron had stood beside her, his hand warm on her back, his voice steady as he introduced her as his queen, his mate, his everything. And something in the way he said it, the absolute certainty, the barely contained threat to anyone who might challenge his choice, had silenced the objections before they could begin. Now, 2 months later, Rosalind stood on a hill overlooking the valley of her grandmother's home. But it looked nothing like she remembered. Where once there had been empty fields and crumbling stone walls, now there was a city. Not a large one, not yet, but the bones of something beautiful. Stone houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, streets paved with cobblestones, a marketplace already bustling with merchants and craftsmen, and at the center of it all, a castle. Not an imposing fortress of war, but something elegant and warm, with wide windows to catch the light and gardens already starting to bloom in the courtyard. The Alpha King's kingdom. Relocated exactly as he'd promised. Rosalind felt Theron's arms wrap around her from behind. He pulled her back against his chest and rested his chin on top of her head. "Do you like it?" he asked, and beneath the casual tone, she could hear the nervousness, the desperate hope that he'd gotten it right. She turned in his arms, reached up to touch his face, traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten in a battle 50 years before she was born. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect." His smile was blinding. "I aim to please, my queen." She was still getting used to that title, still getting used to the weight of the crown that now sat on her head during formal occasions, and the way his people had accepted her without question. They'd welcomed her not because Theron commanded it, but because they could see what she meant to him. Because they wanted him to be happy, and his happiness was bound to hers now, irrevocably and eternally. The ceremony had been small, intimate, just the two of them and his closest advisors, standing in a moonlit clearing while the bond sealed itself permanently between them. Rosalind had felt it lock into place, a golden chain linking her soul to his, and she'd known with absolute certainty that this was right, that this was where she was meant to be. Her uncle had been arrested 3 weeks ago. The evidence Theron's people had gathered was irrefutable, and he'd confessed within hours of being taken into custody. The estate that had been her parents' was hers again, though she'd given it to the village that had sheltered her during her darkest days. She didn't need it anymore. She had something better. She had a home. The morning sun was warm on her face as Rosalind walked through the marketplace, nodding to the merchants who called out greetings. They knew her now. These wolves and humans who had followed their king to this new land. They'd stopped bowing when she passed, stopped treating her like a delicate thing to be handled with care. Now they smiled, waved. A baker pressed a fresh roll into her hands and refused payment. A blacksmith's daughter showed off the sword she was learning to forge. This was her life now. This impossible, beautiful life. Theron found her in the garden that evening, sitting on a stone bench beneath an apple tree that wouldn't bear fruit for another season. He lowered himself beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The council meeting went long," he said by way of explanation. "Trade disputes with the eastern provinces." She hummed in acknowledgement, leaning into his warmth. The bond between them pulsed gently, content in the closeness. "I have something for you," Theron said after a moment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "You've already given me a kingdom? What could possibly top that?" His smile was soft, almost shy. Open it. Inside the pouch was a ring. Simple, elegant. A band of silver set with a single stone that caught the light like captured starfire. Rosalind's breath caught. It was my mother's, Theron said quietly. She wore it on her left hand for 300 years. When she died, she made me promise to give it to my mate. He paused. I've been carrying it since I was 27 years old. Tears blurred her vision. Theron, I know we've already bonded. I know you're already my queen in every way that matters. But I wanted. He hesitated, and she realized with a start that the Alpha King was nervous. I wanted to do this properly, the human way. He slid off the bench and knelt before her on the grass. Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs. Rosalind Blackwood, he said, and his voice was steady now, certain. Will you marry me? She laughed through her tears, pulled him up from the grass and kissed him until they were both breathless. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and when the stone caught the last rays of the setting sun, it blazed with light. I love you, she said. The words still felt new on her tongue, still made her heart race every time she spoke them. Theron's arms tightened around her. I love you too. More than I have words to express. More than I thought it was possible to love anything. She kissed him, slow and sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, his eyes were soft and warm and fixed on her face like she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. So, she said, grinning up at him, still think it was worth relocating an entire kingdom? He pretended to consider the question, made a show of looking around at the valley, at the city his people had built in record time, at the castle that would be their home for the rest of their lives. Then he looked back at her. Smiled that devastating smile that still made her knees weak, even after all these weeks. Absolutely, he said. Every single day for the rest of eternity. She laughed and kissed him again, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Others joined in, voices rising in a song of celebration and welcome and joy. The sun was setting now, painting the river gold just like she remembered, just like she dreamed about during all those years of running. But it was better than any dream, because Theron was here, solid and warm and real, and the bond between them was singing with contentment. Rosalind pressed her hand to her heart, where the bond glowed warm and golden and unbreakable. She had spent 3 years running. 3 years believing that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, that home was a concept that would never apply to someone like her. But she'd been wrong. Home wasn't a place. Home was this man, this bond, this feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. And she was never running again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories.